Joining me now is our team of reporters. Monica Alba is at the White House, Sahil Kapur on Capitol Hill, and Julie Tsirkin in the battleground state of Pennsylvania. Monica, let's start with you. What's the latest? It seems like every time I talk to someone, they say, what's going to happen? Did last night's speech by former President Trump have any impact on President Biden's thinking?
I think it hardened his resolve, at least publicly, Ryan, that he is dedicated to staying in this race, that he is committed to continuing this fight, as he said in that statement that you highlighted in your introduction, where he is talking about the future. He's talking about heading out on the campaign trail next week, saying that he really wants to put the focus back on Donald Trump and his agenda and what was on display during the Republican National Convention this week in Milwaukee. But of course, the backdrop to all of that is this massive conversation that's going on with people that he's close to, with people that he has known and worked with for years, who are really wondering about his own path forward beyond the maybe next couple of days or weeks, and who are evaluating his larger future and legacy. And that has really entered the chat now in terms of the last couple of weeks, where there was a lot of day-by-day discussion, and now it's a little bit more long-term thinking of how is Joe Biden going to be remembered in history because of this very complicated moment. So I think now that the RNC has wrapped, the Democrats and the re-election effort are obviously trying to project this image of confidence and full steam ahead, and that's what you saw from the campaign co-chair, and that is what we are hearing from Biden campaign officials on the record, who are really talking about this again in terms of what the president is doing. But what we know from our reporting is that, yes, this will be up to President Biden to ultimately make this decision about staying in the race. And from what we understand, he hasn't decided yet. So that leaves the option that he could ultimately decide to bow out, even if that's not what he's saying right now, Ryan.
Yeah, maybe talk and expand on that a little bit more, because I do think it's significant that the family's even opening up this line of conversation about the potential of him not continuing on in this race. It's important for our viewers to keep in mind that there's only one person that can make that decision. It's President Biden, and it seems as though he is not quite there yet.
I think that's exactly right. And so this is coming from people who obviously love him so deeply that they're trying to take his years of public service and time in office and say, well, if you were to think about leaving the race and bowing out, what would that look like? And would it be befitting of what you've done for this country, according to the conversations that our sources have told us about, that they're evaluating those kinds of things when they're having the discussions. But that, again, it's all very hypothetical because the president himself hasn't come to a conclusion one way or the other. But we do know that over the last couple of days, some of his own conversations with other people, with allies and people who are calling him, they have become more reality-based, we're told, where he himself is confronting this question of, if I was to make this really consequential, really monumental decision, what would that look like? And the takeaway, Ryan, is that we understand the president wants to be able to do that with his own timeline and with a little bit of space. So that is why that is something that could still be a couple of days or weeks away, potentially. We just don't know.
Meanwhile, that would quickly shift the focus to Vice President Harris. We understand that she led a call with some Democratic donors. What more do we know about that?
Yeah, she just wrapped up that call, and she offered some remarks that were really similar to what she talked about when she was on the trail in North Carolina yesterday, trying to talk about the RNC and this question of unity, and saying that if you're going to really use that term, you need to go beyond the one word and demonstrate how you would do that. So again, trying to put that back on Republicans. But she opened the conversation with Democratic donors, I'm told, by saying, look, I'm very confident in President Biden, and we are going to win this election. That was her prediction. And we should point out, Ryan, if people are thinking, wait, well, why is the vice president talking to Democratic donors and not the president? I'm told by a campaign official that it was the president's advisors who asked her to do this call. But we really should point out to everybody, all the reporting we've been doing for weeks, which is that there's a massive issue when it comes to top donors who have severe concerns and anxieties about the health of President Biden's campaign and his future. And they're saying, wait a second, I may not donate if I don't know if he's going to stay at the top of the ticket or potentially move out and somebody else could come in. So this is probably an attempt to try to calm that in some sense. But again, it was the vice president delivering that message and trying to say that the Biden-Harris ticket was full steam ahead.
Okay, we'll have to see how this all plays out. Thank you for that, Monica. Let's move down Pennsylvania Avenue to Sahil Kapur on Capitol Hill. Sahil, it seems like every time we check our phone, there's a new member of the Democratic caucus on Capitol Hill calling for Biden to drop out today. It seems as though this stream is flowing once again. Who stands out to you in the list that emerged today?
A few things stand out, Ryan. The first is the number. 11 Democrats in a single day. I believe that's the most number of Democrats who have come out calling for President Biden to step aside in any day of this entire campaign. And then the other thing that stands out is the broad cross-section of the party that these new members calling on him to step aside represent, starting with Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren. Let's show her statement. She's a California Democrat, a close ally of former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, tells Biden, quote, "Your candidacy is on a trajectory to lose the White House and potentially impact crucial House and Senate races down ballot. It is for these reasons that I ask you to step aside from our party's nomination." In addition, members calling on Biden to step aside include Mark Vesey, a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, Mark Pocan, a member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Chuy Garcia, a member of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Greg Landsman, who represents a swing district in Cincinnati, one of those districts that'll determine which party is likely to control the House, and Senator Martin Heinrich, a New Mexico Democrat. Joe Biden served in that chamber for a long time. He's a bit of a Senate snob himself. Those voices all matter. So this is not simply one faction of people, one set of people that Joe Biden can point to and say, oh, well, there's a whole other set of people who do support me. This is evidence of cracks all over this dam.
All right, Sahil, and we'll talk to Congressman Landsman in just a few minutes on this program. Sahil, thank you for that. Let's move now to the battleground, and that's Pennsylvania, where Julie Tsirkin is standing by. So, Julie, you spent the day with Senator Bob Casey. He is facing a tough re-election campaign. He has, for the most part, stuck by President Biden, albeit, I would say, with a lot of enthusiasm. Where does he stand today on Biden's candidacy?
And I'll tell you, Ryan, having asked him the same questions yesterday in a rural county about 3 hours from here, to come in over here in Drexel Hill, the suburbs of Philadelphia, asking Casey again if he's in Biden's corner, there's a little bit of an opening there, a little bit of a softening. And Casey says that's because he's been talking to voters and constituents all around the state like we have, and perhaps he should take in their considerations and concerns about Biden more seriously. Take a listen to this.
I've heard a lot of people across the state come to me and express real concerns about him going forward, and I think that's a concern that I've got to be responsive to and listen to. I don't think there's a specific timeline, but I do think it's going to be very soon where we have to begin to move forward. We can't stay in the position we're in right now where there's no definitive determination, because the differences in this election.
And the point Casey was making there is we have to get back to talking about what is wrong with the other side, the problems and the challenges with the Republican Party, especially with former President Donald Trump at the top of that ticket. Casey, though, you heard him talking about the timeline there. Look, he is outperforming Biden in this state. Obviously, that is notable and important for Casey heading into November against his Republican opponent. But this allyship with the Biden family goes decades back for Casey. And so this is a situation of respect and love for Biden as a person, where he just doesn't want to get over his skis here, despite the concerns that he's hearing, Ryan.
But you've also been having these same conversations he's been having with voters. What are they telling you about the political moment we find ourselves in?
100%. And I actually spoke to one voter, one woman named Jeanette, as she was going into the event that Casey was holding with suburban women here. And I asked her that very question. What do you make of all of this? And she said yesterday is the day that she decided, after talking to her family members and friends, that President Biden cannot be the person that wins in November, that leads the ticket. And it is because of that she came here today to try to talk to Senator Casey, who she respects as well, to try and change his mind here. I also spoke to other Democratic voters. They all overwhelmingly said that they are bleak, they are grim. This mood over the last month since the debate that we saw on June 27th has just left them feeling sick. One woman I spoke to said there's just no time to make a change with 3 months until November. She said she would vote for Biden, in her words, quote, even if he was on a ventilator. So a range of opinions here, but overwhelmingly, as Casey said, he's hearing from voters that they have concerns. He's not going to join his other two colleagues, Senator Martin Heinrich and Jon Tester, another vulnerable Democrat in a battleground state, in calling on Biden to exit the race just yet. But certainly there is some room there potentially in the coming days, depending on what President Biden does.
All right, Julie, getting the important perspective on the ground with the voters that matter. Julie Tsirkin, thank you for that report. Let's go now to Symone Sanders Townsend, the co-host of the weekend on MSNBC. She's, of course, a former senior advisor to the Biden-Harris 2020 campaign and worked for Kamala Harris. So, Symone, you know the president well. What's weighing on him right now? He says that he's made a decision. Obviously, this isn't being accepted by the party. How could this play out?
Well, Ryan, look, I think it's an important question. I think part of what just knowing the president, what is likely weighing on him is I think you and I have discussed this before. I think back to 2019, 2020, when a lot of the Democratic candidates were still in the race in that primary. There were many of them that did not truly have a viable path. And I remember then candidate Biden pulled us aside in one of our meetings and told us he doesn't want anybody calling on anyone else to drop out. That's not something he is going to do. And then he went forward and went ahead and said that publicly when he was asked by reporters at the time, because he said this is a personal decision that this is for the candidate to make. And he's been a candidate. He's had to make that decision before, and he would never want anyone to pressure him, and he would not pressure anyone else. And so I have to imagine that he is just personally stunned by the volume of individuals who are coming out that he has known for years saying he should step down.
You know better than anyone how close his family is and how he holds them tight and leans on their counsel with almost every decision that he makes, particularly about his own political future. So how important are these conversations that he's having with his family? Do you think that they would all be on the same page? Could there be mixed opinions within the family? And how important will they be in preserving his legacy if he does decide that this is the end of his political career?
I think within a family, there's going to be a very, I could just imagine a conversation with my own family, Brian, about what in making a decision. I think at the end of the day, it's going to be Joe Biden's decision. And as of this right now, as we speak, at what is it, about a little over past 4:15 Eastern Standard Time, Joe Biden is in this race. And he has said for weeks, frankly, in the face of the calls to step down, that he is in this race. I have described it as he's swimming against the tide. And I think as long as the president would like to swim, he is going to continue to stay in the race. And it's really a standoff right now, Ryan. You have elected leaders on Capitol Hill, more which are coming out by the hour, saying they like Joe Biden, but he should step down. Then on the other hand, you have voters. Just yesterday, 1,400 Black women signed a letter. These are grassroots leaders across the country saying they backed the Biden-Harris ticket, and the time for a debate about who the nominee should be was during the primaries. And so these women who are representative leaders of their communities across the country, in many of them battleground states, are saying he shouldn't leave. Then you've got DNC members who are saying, look, we're with the president if he's in it, and the DNC members and the delegates, many of which are saying we still, I haven't spoken to a delegate, and I talked to a number who hasn't said that they are now not supporting the president. And the caucus chairs of the DNC various caucuses are still saying that their pledged delegates are staying pledged delegates. And so it is like a game of chicken, for lack of a better term. And the question is, who is going to blink first? The president is resolute, but the opposition to his candidacy on Capitol Hill is also resolute, Ryan. And I think the last point I'll make is you hear a lot from the elected members of Congress about polling data. You just heard Senator Casey talk about, what he's hearing from people in his districts, a voter themselves saying, I want to speak to Senator Casey about this. The polling is not predictive. It's indicative of where people are at any given time. What I've heard from a number of House Democrats specifically and Senate Democrats who have always were going to have a tough time this cycle, with the polling that they are seeing, is they feel like to them it is insurmountable. Now, the work of a campaign is to do the work to change the polling. I'm hearing a lot of members say they don't want to do that work with President Biden on their coattails, but still many more saying that they, at this point, are still with him.
All right, we don't have that much more time, but you're such a great person to talk to about this because your experience is so wide and varying within the Democratic Party. I'm interested in your take on how progressives are going to respond to all of this. They seem to be the group that right now is most firmly in the camp of Biden shouldn't go. I'm talking about Bernie Sanders, AOC, and others. You work for Bernie Sanders. If Biden does decide to go, are progressives just going to stand by and let Kamala Harris become the nominee? Are they going to want to have a say in who her running mate is? They're such an important part of the base of this Democratic Party. What role are they going to play in this discussion? Because at this point, I feel like they're not getting that much attention.
Well, look, Ryan, I think the reality is, just from a pure process party standpoint, the ticket is the Biden-Harris ticket. And you just reported on the call that Vice President Harris did with the donors. So her name is on the money that has also been raised. I think, frankly, the smoothest path here is that Joe Biden stays in this race and everybody just backs up and Democrats get about the business of trying to win an election in general. But I think the next step, if the president does decide he can no longer swim against the tide, the vice president is the only choice. You know, she is battle tested. She has been doing the work. And when I say the work, I mean, I think back to when the United States got into a dust up with France over their deal with Australia on the submarines. It was the vice president that the president asked to go to France and smooth over things with President Macron. The work that she's done, helping the president rally European allies, especially right before and in the immediate aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And so there's just some of this is like, when the convention comes, it's about 2 months a month until people actually start voting with the early vote. You do not have a lot of time to raise a lot of new money and introduce someone to the voters. And so the vice president, to me, seems like the most viable path. And I don't know if progressives across the board are going to stick with her, but I saw AOC's live last night, and she seemed to be in the Kamala Harris camp.
Well, Symone, you are my queen on many levels, but I know you've had a hellish day trying to travel across this country, and you were caught up in the travel nightmare that so many Americans were, and went to great lengths to be on this program today.
Coming to you live from Baltimore Penn Station,
It
Ryan.
looks great. It means so much to all of us that you made that effort. I thank you so much. Thanks.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.